Do you all know this guy? Mirek? Yeah, yes, I know you know him. But does anybody else know this guy? He is, well, he was Czech. And he moved to England and then changed his name and became Robert Maxwell. He was a little bit unscrupulous, shall we say. He made lots of money by sort of various means. Not all of them were wholesome, but there we are. We have quite a few folks of the same variety in England, and they're everywhere. And when I was 18, according to English law, I'm old enough to drink and I'm old enough to vote. And Robert Maxwell was a candidate to become MP, Member of Parliament. And I voted for one of the other guys. But in the pub that evening, and Robert Maxwell won, and everybody knew that this guy was a crook. And his name was the Bouncing Czech. That was his nickname. And I'll talk a little bit more about him in a moment. But we have the extraordinary situation in life where, well, life is pretty complicated. And sometimes we have, like in a motor car, you have a speedometer, and it's not binary. It's not just reading fast or slow. It's calibrated in kilometers per hour. And thermometers are another instrument which are calibrated. They're not high, temperatures are not high or low. They're calibrated in degrees. And there's only one profession which uses binary instruments, and that's politics. There are instruments which measure opinion in calibrations, in preferences, but politicians don't like those systems. They prefer just yes or no. And it means that the reason why is that the leader, then he or she chooses the question, holds a vote, and then acts as if the outcome is the democratic will or something. And the people who do this are autocrats and theocrats and Democrats, not only Democrats. They are all over the world. For example, we have Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran, and he had his referendum, which to make Iran Islamic, and sure enough, 99%. In China, you had Deng Xiaoping at the time of the Tiananmen Square, and the Chinese Communist Party Standing Committee took the decision on military intervention, yes or no, as if there were only two options on the table, which of course was total nonsense. And that vote, it is said, passed by a margin of 1. And today, as we all know, we have Putin in Ukraine, who is concocting questions for Crimea and Donetsk and Luhansk. But it's exactly what happens in the UK over Brexit and elsewhere. And it's also interesting to note that the North Korean constitution stipulates that decisions should be taken by majority vote. It's in Article 97, and it doesn't happen very often because their parliament meets only once a year. But this is what we believe in the West. And the basic plank or principle or foundation of Western diplomacy is that we in the West know, well, everything actually, which means other people don't know anything or very little. And when Gorbachev came to power in 1985, and this was the end of the Cold War, and it was great news, and we rushed over to tell him how to do things, because obviously he didn't know anything. And one of the advisors to Mr. Gorbachev was Mr. Robert Maxwell. And for democratization, the experts, as you will all know in this room, there are some native English speakers and Americans and things who call themselves experts even though they don't know the other guy's language. But anyway, they told Gorbachev that you need democratization, so you have to have elections, and then you elect a parliament, and you can call it a Duma if you like, yeah, that's okay. And then you, as president, you propose legislation, and then the Duma will debate this, and they will argue all day, but eventually they take a majority vote, and if you get a majority, then that's okay, and you can put it into law. So we were saying, Mr. Gorbachev, you need majoritarianism. But Mr. Gorbachev doesn't speak English. So we had to speak in Russian. And we said, Mikhail Sergeyevich, вам нужен. Who speaks? Может быть, кто-то здесь говорит по-русски? Нет? А, вы говорите. Окей, хорошо. Как сказать по-русски?
Что?
Как сказать по-русски majoritarianism? How do you say in Russian the word majoritarianism?
Так добрый лисан.
Что?
We don't learn it.
Bolshevism. So we were telling Gorbachev that he should be a little Bolshevik. And we are all little Bolsheviks. We believe in majority voting. 50% plus one, that's all you need. And I've told this story quite often in Russia or with Russian-speaking people in the audience, and always the mouth just drops and they realize that this is what we in the West have been promoting. And it's part of the other stuff of democratization that we promote, like self-determination. And this was during the First World War, American President Woodrow Wilson, and he said all peoples have the right of self-determination. We didn't sort of, well, it was meant to be a way by which a country could get rid of the imperial power, because America was pretending that it wasn't imperialist. But it wasn't really a means by which you solve problems of successionism. But the other thing that, well, he recognized it later on. And it's horrific to see how people make mistakes and they're in positions of authority and they don't understand what they're doing. And it's, well, so Russia in 1985 goes democratic. And the principle of self-determination is part of democratization. And sure enough, they had the first clashes, the first ethnic clashes in the Soviet Union were in August 1988 in Nagorno-Karabakh. And the headline in Pravda the next morning was "Vot nash Ulster." This is our Northern Ireland. They were spot on. They're absolutely correct. And it's probably fair to say that nobody in Northern Ireland knew what Nagorno-Karabakh was, let alone where or anything about it at all. Quite extraordinary, but they were absolutely right. And then there were other ethnic clashes, not least in the Balkans. And in Slovenia, you had a referendum and then a war. It's a small war, but it was still a war. In Croatia, you had 2 referendums, and then they had a war. And in Bosnia, you had, the first thing that you had was an election, and they were 40-30-20. 40% Muslim, 30% Orthodox, 20% Catholic. So there was no majority, but any 2 could gang up against the other one and be a majority. And Radovan Karadzic had said that if there is to be a referendum, that there will be war. And despite this, the European Union insisted, this was the Badinter Commission, 5 Supreme Court judges, and they insisted on a referendum. And yeah, it started the war. On the day of the referendum, the barricades went up in Sarajevo, and it didn't take much longer for all-out war. The rest, as they say, is history. And today, it's the same in Ukraine. So in 1985, the West told Moscow that it had to be majoritarian, and in 1991, when Ukraine becomes an independent nation, we say Kiev has to have majority rule as well. And in 2004, this was Yushchenko. He won by a very narrow margin, but he won, and 50% plus 1, that's a majority. So we were happy enough with that. But then in 2010, the tables were reversed, and it was Yanukovych. So that was not so good. But we said majority rule, so we just had to sort of lump it. And then there was Maidan. And in February 2014, with people being killed in Kiev, and the European Union then changed its mind. And we decided that democracy is not majority rule, it's power sharing, which is the opposite. And we rushed over to Kiev and said, no, it's not power sharing, it's not majority rule, it's power sharing. And we arrived on the very day that Yanukovych ran into exile. Putin doesn't like losing very much. So there was then the referendum in Crimea. There had already been a referendum in 1991. Well, they were having another one. And it's what we cater for in the Belfast Agreement. And then there was the referendums in Donetsk and Luhansk. And 2014, remember, was also the year of the Scottish referendum. And the word Scotland, Shotlandia, was used in Luhansk by Russian separatists to justify the unjustifiable. And people in Scotland, or in Ireland for that matter, Ireland, Sinn Féin want a referendum for Irish unity, and Scotland wants a referendum for Scottish independence, and they are not interested in Ukraine. It's horrific. And it's partly because there is this, in the West anyway, there is this crazy idea that when you're talking about voting, you can talk about elections. Yeah, that's all right. And there are lots of electoral systems, as we know. But we don't talk about decision-making. No, decision-making, that just has to be a majority vote. That's just the way things are. And so if we start with America, and George Washington, he thought the European party system, the two-party system, was dreadful. And he was quite right. And some of the founding fathers, like Jefferson, actually invented a system of PR, but they didn't change their decision-making. And they stayed with majority voting. And Congress, as we all know, takes its decisions by majority vote. And we now have this stupid argument in America as to who has got the majority of one, and is it going to be in both houses or just in one house, and so on. The original American electoral system said that the winner of a presidential election will be the president, and that the runner-up will be the vice president. What a good idea. But then they changed that. Didn't last for very long. And they have had this divisive system ever since. And if you have a divisive system, you will divide, and the ultimate is Donald Trump. Well, I hope he's the ultimate. I can't see how you can get worse. And the next one is Germany. And it's extraordinary when in 1949, just after the Second World War, and people looked back at what happened in Germany, and they thought, well, the Weimar Republic, yeah, it went wrong, and they blamed PR. And it wasn't PR. It was the fact that the decisions were taken by majority vote. But they nevertheless decided that it was PR. So they changed the electoral system, so they now have it's half, as you know, it's half PR and half first past the post. But for decision making in the Bundestag, no, that was still to be majority vote. And this sentence here that I'm quoting, that is from the basic law. I didn't speak German, but it's in my English version. It's gobbledygook, it's nonsense. I mean, how can you talk about the whole German people when you say you only want a majority of them? It's total nonsense. And yet professors and others believe it. And it was very similar in Dayton when, with the West, I suppose, sorted out Bosnia, and they looked at the electoral system and they introduced PR, but for decision making, no, that's just majority voting. And it's the same in Belfast. We have PRSTV, which they decided to keep, but majority voting was the decision making. So I now want to point out that this majority voting is actually a total nonsense. And if we imagine a situation in England a few years ago of 9 people or 9 million, doesn't matter, talking about what was then the status quo of the UK in the EU. All 9 of them, yeah, they agreed that they didn't like that very much. But they didn't agree on what should be the alternative. And 4 of them said, let's be in the EEA, the European Economic Area. And 3 said, no, hang on, wouldn't the customs union be better? And 2 of them said WTO, World Trade Organization. So they had their differences, which we will call preferences. And let us imagine that the preferences are like this. So, one way of resolving differences is by majority voting, they say. And if we take, well, one sort of majority voting is just when you have option X, yes or no. And so we ignore all the information in the brown, and we just look at the first preferences, and we see that, well, only 4 people like B, so 5 prefer something else, and only 3 people like C, so 6 people prefer something else, and there's a majority against everything. So that's not very good. So maybe the other sort of majority voting, which is called a pairing, and you take 2 options, option X or option Y. And if we look at A and B, we see that 4 people prefer B to A. Where's my little arrow gone? I don't know. And 5 people prefer A to B. So down in the bottom, and we see that A is more popular than B. Oh, there it is. Ah, yes, here we are. By 5 to 4. So A is more popular than B. Okay. And we also see that B is more popular than C. And yeah, 4 plus 2 people prefer B to C, and only 3 people prefer C to B. So A is more popular than B, and B is more popular than C, and C is more popular than D, and D is more popular than A, and A is more popular than B, and you go round and round and sorry, I can't quite see the bottom there, can we? Whoops, no, that's no good either. Yeah, there we are. That's better. Yeah, so A is more popular than B, is more popular than C, is more popular than D, is more popular than A, is more popular than D, and you go round and round in circles forever. And it's called the paradox of binary voting. So looking at pairings isn't very good either. And the ancient Greeks were aware about this. The ancient Greeks knew of one voting system, and that's binary voting only. But they were also aware that if there isn't a majority in favor of any one thing, you've got problems. So they invented a procedure. And basically, if you have the status quo, option A, which some people don't like very much, then somebody might suggest an alternative, move a motion, option B, and maybe other people have different ideas and propose amendments, C and D. And the way we do things, according to the ancient Greeks, is that we first of all choose the preferred amendment, C versus D, and then the winner of that against, do we accept or reject this amendment, to get the substantive, as it's called, and then the final binary vote is the substantive versus the status quo to get the answer. And so if we look at that voter's profile, the first thing is C versus D, and oh look, 7 people prefer C to D. So it's then C versus B, and 4 plus 2 people prefer B to C. So it's then B versus A, and 3 plus 2 people prefer A to B. So the answer is A. So having decided verbally that they don't like option A, they then decide democratically that they like option A. So in this instance, majority voting is actually wrong. The answer is wrong. And majority voting is sometimes hopelessly inaccurate. Hopelessly. It's worse than that, because if C is the motion, and B and D are the possible amendments, then the answer is C. Or if D is the motion, and B and C are the amendments, the answer is D. Or if you can get anything you like. If you are the chair, or if you are the boss, if you are the prime minister, you can get anything you like. So what happened in the United Kingdom with Brexit was, first of all, David Cameron has a referendum on only one option. There are lots of options on the table in the EU, in the EEA, customs union, but he has only one majority vote on only one option. And it loses by a little bit. But I would argue that if they'd had other majority votes on the other options, they would also have lost, and by much bigger margins. So that's the end of David Cameron, and along comes Theresa May, and she has what she called indicative votes, and they had 4 options on the table in the House of Commons. And they voted, but they used majority voting. So they took 4 majority votes, and of course there was a majority against everything. So the indicative votes indicated nothing. Oh, how crazy can you get? So then along comes Boris Johnson, and he has his deal. And if it had been a straight vote, his deal, yes or no, then his deal would have lost like any other option. So he chooses to have a pairing by manipulating things, and the vote is his deal or no deal. And no deal was the most unpopular option of all. So any deal versus no deal would have been a victory for any deal. And the fact that his deal beat no deal meant nothing or everything. I mean, it's just crazy, it really is. And trying to get the British media or the British academia or anybody to even question this basic nonsense of binary voting, no, they're not interested. But I would argue that if it's a pluralist democracy, then in any controversy there will be more than 2 options on the table, and there should be more than 2 options on the ballot paper. And as we said at the beginning, there are lots of electoral systems, but that's sometimes you're electing one person, sometimes you're electing quite a few, sometimes it's proportional, and yeah, lots of systems. But with decision making, you're only making one decision. So there are relatively fewer methodologies. And one of them is called plurality voting. And you have your preferences, but you ignore second, third, fourth preferences, all the information in the brown here, and you look only at the first preferences, and the winner is W with a score of 5. It's not a majority, it's only the largest minority, but oh well. But some people say, no, you have to have a 2-round system. People like, well, the Czechs, or the French, or the Ukrainians, or Brazilians. And they look at the first round, and if nothing gets a majority, they then take the 2 leading options, W and X, and they have a second round, and if everybody's preferences stay the same, then X now wins on a score of 9, which is a majority. Ah, okay. The other way of doing things is with the alternative vote, or ranked choice voting, as the Americans call it, or single transferable vote is what we call it. And again, you start off with the plurality vote, and if nothing gets a majority, you eliminate the smallest one, which is Z, and its 2 votes go to the second preference, which is Y. So the score becomes 5 for W, 4 for X, and 5 for Y. Still nothing with a majority, so you now eliminate X, and its 4 votes go to, well, they can't go to Z because Z has been eliminated. So they go to Y, and the winner is now Y on a score of 9, which is a majority. It's a different majority, but oh well. And the other way of doing things is what we call the modified Borda count. It was invented in 1433. And it hasn't been used very often. And basically it's a point system. It is the only methodology which always takes all preferences cast by all voters into account. It's a very simple point system, and sure enough the winner is now Z on a score of 44. So if we compare these methodologies, we see that for this given profile, the winner can be either W, X, or Y, or Z, according to the voting system used. So again, the choice of voting system can be a means by which the politician can manipulate things. It's a little bit more difficult now, of course. Manipulating a majority vote is relatively easy, and manipulating a multi-option vote is much more difficult. But we see that the modified Borda count, which I argue is the most accurate, has the social choice of Z and the social ranking, first, second, third, fourth, of Z, Y, X, W, which is the exact opposite of what you get with plurality voting, W, X, Y, Z. So plurality voting is wrong, and in this instance couldn't be more wrong. It's shocking, horrible. So I argue that decisions wherever, whether it's in a parliament or a congress or in a referendum, whatever it is, if it's controversial, then it should be done in a multi-option ballot, and ideally in a preferential ballot, and you choose the option with the highest average preference. And an average, well, that involves every voter. So the words majority and minority can fade from the political lexicon. And let's face it, majority and minority, they are a plague at the moment, not only in Northern Ireland, but throughout the Middle East and in the Balkans and the Caucasus and Rwanda and in all over the place. So to get rid of that and to move to an inclusive democracy, I think would be a step towards a more civilized world. And there's also the fact that COVID and climate change are telling us to cooperate. Well, we can't do that very well if we are forever taking votes for or against each other. But by casting preferences, then we can vote with each other, and nobody has to be against anybody. That's it.
I was just thinking, you are presenting you haven't been, you didn't speak about matrix vote, which is one of your ideas for voting in parliaments. And and congresses and so on. And the idea is that there are all the parties which are working on the creating and building the government are all for the same ideas. I think it's definitely bold, but the idea of a consensual government, which is made of all the parties in this way. And so my question is, what makes you believe that it's actually possible in practice to make this if you have like different political subjects, to make them work together just by preferential voting?
If you have the present situation whereby Xi Jinping just chooses his own cronies, or Putin, or Boris Johnson, or whatever, then that's not very good. And the alternative, if you have a multi-party parliament, as you do here, or, well, the world record is in Belgium, as I'm sure you know, and they took 541 days to sort out a government, by which time it was ready for another election and it all starts all over again, which is crazy. And what should happen, if you believe in democracy, then the democratic process should be able to identify the option which best represents society. And if we are Democrats in this room and we want to make a decision about something, then we should be able to identify that by modified border count or whatever. And then if we believe in democracy, then if we are the elected representatives, then we should be prepared to implement that collective will. And ideally, if the people are electing the parliament and then the parliament is electing the government, then the will of parliament, if it's a fair electoral system, the will of parliament will be roughly the same as the will of the people. And the Democrats who have been elected to parliament should accept collective responsibility for implementing what is then the will of parliament and to put it into law. I suspect that there are some people who might find this very difficult, like Trump and Bolsonaro and Modi and Netanyahu and a whole load of others. The idea of consensus is not in their DNA. And they would find, they'd probably walk out actually. They would refuse to cooperate in a system which they cannot dominate. And the danger is, of course, at the moment with majority rule, is that we are in the situation where, as in Italy, where a right-wing majority can then take over in the name of democracy. By which time we're too late, we've lost. And if we are really worried about the rise of the right wing, or any other wing for that matter, a religious wing or extreme left wing or whatever, then we should really be insisting on consensus decision making. And the people who will be prepared to use this will be, the true Democrats, the ones who are prepared to cooperate, who are prepared to not insist on their particular point of view as if it must win. And if you have the voting system like the NBC, in which case you get the average opinion, so everybody's contributing, but nobody is dominating, then I think this could work.
So you think there is a need of something like reworking of the system in the parliament which would be painful, because these people this is some of the major aspects of being a politician nowadays, that you are a majoritarian.
Yeah.
I think at least that.
And we have, at home anyway, we have the whip system. So the MP is told what to do, And they're not allowed to have a silly thing up here called a conscience. You're just told that you have to do it like this. And yeah, I referred to North Korea, and in North Korea they have elections, and basically what happens is that the party chooses the candidate, Mr. X, it's normally Mr., and then the people vote Mr. X, yes or no. Well, actually it's yes or yes, and that's it. And in the House of Commons, what happens is that the Prime Minister chooses the option X, and then uses the whip so that the members of his party, if we take Boris Johnson, yeah, they then vote yes or yes. Option X, yes or yes. And the opposition vote option X, no or no. And we complain about North Korea, but we don't complain about ourselves. But basically the system that we are using is North Korean. It is it is the elected dictatorship.
Working camps and so on.
Yeah.
Some other things, I guess.
Oh yeah, I mean, I was in North Korea a few years ago, and I'm not trying to condone the North Korean system. I'm not trying to say that there aren't horrible differences between what we have and what they have. But the fact that they are using a voting system that we are using as well should really make us question, why on earth are we doing this? Especially when there are other systems, other ways of making decisions which are so much better. And there's the modified border count, and there's the Condorcet rule, which I didn't mention, but it's another very good system. We do have the possibility with preferential voting of identifying the collective will, but we just don't use it. And one of the hopes is that with computers, when you don't have computers, then voting on two options, either it's yes or no, and we have two arms, and so you can do that fairly easily. Once you move to three options, then you can, if you're preference voting, it can be ABC or CAB or BCA or K. There are 6 ways of voting. And if you have 4 options, there are 24 ways of voting. And with 5, it's 120. And we only have 2 arms. And so it becomes very difficult until you have computers. And we all have the smart machines, and out they come. And so you have a 5-option debate, and then everybody just goes 3, 2, 5, 4, 1, whatever, and you wait for a nanosecond, and out comes the answer. And it's so nowadays with computers and with smartphones and things, consensus voting is actually possible. Earlier it wasn't, but today it is. And the other thing that I argue for is that we have to change human rights. They talk about democratic rights, but they are glib. The United Nations Charter on Human Rights, I mean, it mentions elections. It doesn't talk about decision-making at all. It's not there. It doesn't exist. And even on elections, it's very glib. It really is. So we have to get the lawyers on board as well. And that's going to be quite difficult. And I've tried, and so far I have not succeeded at all. But there again, I haven't succeeded very much with the political scientists either.
We have Karel, which also has this sometimes issue with promoting our system, the D21, which is also like, it's not preferential, but it allows consensus on this. Like, it's easier to use, at least we believe so, and we make like research on this topic. And yeah, we also have a hard time sometimes to explain to the public and some political scientists that this could be a like change for the better.
Yeah.
So yeah, consensus.
I can maybe continue if I can. When you spoke about this D21, I'm going to more familiar for you sphere, which is approval vote. Because this morning I had a couple of minutes, hours to see your book, to read a few chapters. And when you spoke about a provable thing, you said something like it's quite okay, I guess, but it's more suitable into the for the in the context of societies which are already consensual somehow.
Yeah.
As I see your presentation of Borda account and Condors, I see the point. It's from this social utility function of perception. It's quite superior maybe to other electoral systems, but that's only one side of the electoral system. And there is this other side, like what is the strategic response of the politicians to the new rules, which in this way you like omitted in this presentation of approval, which where you didn't consider the strategic response to maybe try to make some more consensual politics, but how do you see this strategic or other any strategical weaknesses among under the modified Borda account?
The way it works, if you have 5 options, yeah, then with the modified Borda account, if I want to vote, I can. Well, if I only want to vote for one option, then I can. And I just give my first preference to this one, and I ignore the others. If I do that, I only get 1 point. And I'm saying nothing about the other options, and I get no points for the other options. But if I vote for 2 options, and this is my first preference and that's my second, so I get 2 points for my first preference and 1 point for my second. And if I vote for 3 options, then I get 3, 2, 1, and so on. So if I want my first preference to get the maximum number of points, then it will be to my advantage to vote for all options. So the system is encouraging the voter, the politician, the parliamentarian, whoever, is encouraging the voter to state not only what is her first preference, but also her compromise options. And in theory, if everybody states their compromise options, it is possible to identify the collective compromise. That is the theory behind modified Borda account. If it's only the Borda account, then they discovered this in the lifetime of Jean-Charles de Borda when he first introduced it, and some people thought, if it's a 5 option, that I get 5 points for my first preference, and they only vote for 1 option and they get 5 points, then the whole idea of the modified Borda account is lost, because it would then encourage people to be intransigent and to not express their compromise options. And it's very similar. So the Borda account, simple Borda account, or whatever we like to call it, is a bit like approval voting, actually. And in approval voting, if you have 5 options, then, okay, you can approve of the one you like, or the ones you like, but by approving of the other ones, you're reducing the chances of your favorite. So approval voting does not encourage the consensual behavior, which is what the modified Borda account does, but nor does the simple Borda account. So, yeah, I argue for the modified Borda account. There was a question behind you?
About the way, when it comes to the decision making, I would like to ask you about the way to choose the alternatives to be picked to vote, because in Borda account it's very important which alternatives are chosen for voting, because when you have a lot of alternatives that are very similar, you can get to a point where it is very easy to strategically pick the variants you can vote for. So what is the way, who should decide which options you can vote for?
Very good question. It is absolutely essential that the choice of options is taken independently. So you have your parliament or your independent commission, as in New Zealand or whatever, and people can have whatever ideas they like, and they can propose those ideas, and as long as they comply with, like, the United Nations Charter on Human Rights, then that's fine. They're on the table. And then the independent commission, or whatever it is, and we all believe in the notion of Mr. Speaker, that there should be somebody, man or woman, whatever, but who is the impartial judge of proceedings. And I would argue that Mr. Speaker should consist not of just one individual, but of quite a few, because it's quite a difficult job. But Mr. Speaker, they choose the options. So everything is on the table, and it's important that you have a balanced list. So when we did this for the first time in Belfast in 1986, and if I can relate the story, we had 1985 was the Anglo-Irish Agreement. And then Mr. Paisley, he protested, and he had 100,000 people, which for Belfast is quite a lot. And they were all there gathered at the City Hall, and he shouts, "Ulster says no." So 1 week later, 6 of us stood in silence with a banner. We've got to say yes to something. And then we had our first conference on preferential voting. At that time, I'd never heard of Jean-Charles de Borda or Nicholas Kousanos or anybody else. But it just struck me as being obvious that we have to allow people to be able to say yes to something, or even some things in their order of preference. So we had this conference, and it was open to the public. And it's a bit like a citizens' assembly, although we didn't use that expression at the time. But they all came. We had everybody from Sinn Féin to the political wing of the Protestant paramilitaries, and everybody else in the middle. And they were all there, and they all advocated their own ideas. We finished up with 12 options on the ballot paper, which is a bit too many, actually. We just took them all. And then they voted with preferences, and the answer was not the option with the most first preferences, but it was the option with the highest average preference. And it was for Northern Ireland to have devolution and power sharing within a joint Belfast, Dublin, London tripartite agreement. So it was a mini Belfast agreement, just 12 years ahead of its time. And if we can get those people in Belfast to work together, then yeah, there's hope for us all. I've done it in Bosnia as well, and yeah, it does work. The other interesting thing on approval voting, by the way, is that it's used in China. Not everybody appreciates the fact that China is, well, that they invented voting over 2,000 years ago, but they invented everything anyway. So that should be no surprise. They were the first country in the world to use multi-option voting, and that was 1,000 years ago. And then, yes, today it's only in the villages that they're using approval voting. And the sad side of it all is that Hu Jintao wanted to introduce this into the towns and to take it further. And Xi Jinping comes along and says, no, can't do that.
Well, the state isn't exactly democratic, even though it's in its name.
Sorry?
Democratic Republic of China, or People's Republic of China.
And
it's not exactly democratic.
And when Xi Jinping writes, he uses the word democracy time and time again. Democratic centralism. Democratic centralism, we in the West know, we say, no, come on, that's crazy. But the expression that Theresa May used was democratic leadership. Well, it's the same thing, isn't it? You know, for heaven's sake. and democratic leadership, it's an oxymoron, like democratic centralism. Total nonsense.